The air in the transport shuttle tasted of ozone and recycled anxiety. Anna Petrova watched the Northern Vigilance Training Complex resolve out of the swirling snow on the main view screen, a collection of low, interconnected domes hunkered against the vast white emptiness of the Arctic. It looked like a scar on the planet, defiant and fragile. The shuttle's engines whined as they began their final descent, the sound, a familiar vibration that settled deep in her bones. She wore a simple gray fleece and standard-issue fatigue trousers, her only identification a laminated clip-on badge that read, Petrova, A, Medical Liaison. It was a title deliberately designed to be ignored, to make her blend into the background like a piece of functional, uninteresting equipment. She preferred it that way. Observation was purer when the subject was unaware of the microscope. The shuttle settled onto the landing pad with a final, shuddering sigh. The hatch hissed open, admitting a blast of air so cold it felt like swallowing glass. Petrova shouldered her plain black duffel bag and descended the ramp, her boots crunching on the grated metal surface. Colonel Eva Rostova was waiting, flanked by a young, sharp-faced lieutenant whose uniform was so crisply pressed it seemed to defy the wind. The colonel's own posture was a study in rigid command. Her face was framed by a severe black haircut, and her eyes, the color of chipped ice, swept over Petrova in a single dismissive glance. "You're the liaison from Central Command?" Rostova's voice was loud, engineered to carry over the howl of the wind and the spooling down of the shuttle's turbines. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation of tardiness. "Yes, Colonel," Petrova said. Her own voice was quiet, level. "We're on a tight schedule," Rostova clipped, turning without waiting for a further response. "This certification is critical. We don't have time for sightseeing. Lieutenant Orlov will show you to your quarters. Stay out of the way of the operational teams. Your input will be solicited, if and only if it is required." The dismissal was as clean and cold as the air. Orlov, the young lieutenant, stepped forward, his expression a careful mirror of his commander's impatience. "This way, ma'am," he said, the ma'am a curt formality, stripped of any genuine respect. He led her from the exposed landing pad into a pressurized connector tube, the sudden silence and warmth a jarring transition. The harsh fluorescent lights of the corridor hummed, reflecting off the polished linoleum floor. "The medical liaison billet is in Module Gamma with the other support staff," Orlov explained, walking at a brisk pace. "You'll have access to the common areas and the primary mess hall. A full schedule of the certification exercises is posted on the community board. As the colonel said, your role is strictly observational." Petrova just nodded, her eyes scanning everything. She noted the emergency lighting panels, the placement of fire extinguishers, the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the floor that suggested the primary generator was running at high capacity. She saw a hairline fracture spiderwebbing from a bolt on a pressure doorframe, so small it would be invisible to a casual glance. She filed it away. Her assigned quarters were little more than a closet containing a bunk and a small locker. Functional, impersonal. Orlov gestured vaguely at the room. "Here you are. Any questions?" "No, Lieutenant," Petrova said. "Thank you." He gave a sharp, almost theatrical nod and was gone, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, leaving her in the sterile silence. She dropped her duffel bag onto the bunk. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. Inside wasn't just clothing. It was a compact, meticulously organized trauma kit, far more comprehensive than anything standard issue. She'd learned long ago to trust only her own gear. For the next hour, she settled in, a process that for her was less about unpacking and more about orienting. She didn't just occupy a space, she mapped it, absorbed it. She walked the corridors of the complex, her gait unhurried, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. She looked like a bored civilian contractor, a middle-aged woman with nothing better to do. But her eyes were constantly moving, cataloging, assessing. She found the main medical bay. It was clean, modern, and looked impressive. A young medic was dutifully restocking a cabinet. Petrova paused in the doorway. "Everything in order?" she asked quietly. The medic glanced up, startled. "Oh, yes, ma'am. Just running final checks before the sim starts." Petrova's gaze drifted to the primary trauma crash cart. "You've checked the expiration on your coagulants?" The medic frowned. "They were checked last month." Check them again, Petrova said, her tone gentle but firm. She didn't wait for an answer, continuing her slow tour. In the engineering section, she saw two technicians arguing in hushed tones over a diagnostic screen displaying the atmospheric processor's output. She didn't stop, but she heard the words intermittent pressure drops and Rostova wants it green-lit no matter what. Her walk eventually led her to the command center, a large circular room dominated by a massive holographic display showing a schematic of the base and real-time environmental data from the exterior. Colonel Rostova stood in the center, a whirlwind of focused energy, firing questions at her staff. What's the status on the exterior sensor array? Fully operational, Colonel. Power consumption levels? Nominal, holding at 85%. Weather forecast? A standard polar front is moving in, Colonel, a meteorologist reported from his console. Winds increasing to 60 knots, temperature dropping to -70°C. Well within expected simulation parameters. Petrova's eyes were on a different screen, a secondary monitor showing raw satellite data. The front didn't look standard. She saw the telltale isobaric compression of a forming polar vortex, a weather event far more violent than a simple front. The model on the main screen was using a simplified, more optimistic algorithm. A man in his late 50s, with the quiet confidence of a career NCO, stood near the edge of the room. His uniform identified him as Master Sergeant Baranov. He seemed to be the only other person not completely caught in Rostova's orbit. His gaze followed the colonel, but his expression was one of weary patience. He then noticed Petrova standing in the doorway. His eyes met hers for a brief moment. He saw where she was looking, at the raw weather data. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement between two people who understood the difference between a report and the truth. Petrova moved on, her presence in the command center going entirely unnoticed by Rostova. She found the mess hall and got a cup of coffee, sitting at an empty table in the corner. She watched the personnel come and go. She saw the stress in the faces of the junior officers, the fear of making a mistake under Rostova's demanding gaze. She saw the gallows humor of the enlisted techs, a coping mechanism as old as organized militaries. This was a command climate built on pressure, not cohesion. Rostova wasn't building a team, she was forging a tool she expected to perform flawlessly under her hand. But tools, under too much pressure, break. Later that day, Rostova held a formal briefing for all senior staff and observers. Petrova took a seat in the back row. The room buzzed with nervous energy. "All right, listen up," Rostova began, her voice sharp. "In 24 hours, this certification exercise goes live. For the following 72 hours, this station will simulate a full operational deployment on Europa. That means complete isolation, reliance on internal systems, and response to multiple high-stress scenarios. Central Command wants to see if we have what it takes. I am here to tell you that we do. Failure is not an option. My expectation is perfection. Is that clear?" A chorus of, "Yes, Colonel," filled the room. Master Sergeant Baranov cleared his throat. "Colonel, a word on the backup generator." Rostova's eyes narrowed. "What about it, Master Sergeant?" "The primary fuel line is exposed on the exterior surface between the fuel depot and the habitat wall. With the forecasted temperature drop, there's a risk of the fuel gelling. It hasn't been tested in a cold soak of this projected intensity." "The line is heated and insulated to regulations, is it not?" Rostova countered, her tone laced with impatience. "It is, Colonel, but the regulations are based on standard Arctic conditions. This approaching system is anomalous. If we lose main power and that fuel line fails, our backup generator will be useless. We'll be dark and cold in minutes." Rostova stared him down. "Your concern is noted and dismissed, Baranov. The systems were certified by the engineers. We will not delay a multi-million-dollar exercise based on your gut feelings. We operate as scheduled. Stick to your duties." Baranov's jaw tightened, but he simply said, "Yes, Colonel," and stepped back. The message to everyone in the room was clear. Do not question the Colonel. Do not bring her problems, only solutions, or better yet, only successes. Petrova watched the exchange without expression. She sipped her lukewarm coffee. She had seen this a dozen times before. A commander so focused on the appearance of success that they became blind to the precursors of failure. They drove their units forward, ignoring the rattling sounds from the engine, convinced that sheer force of will could overcome mechanical reality. It never did. Reality always had the final say. As the briefing concluded and the room began to empty, Petrova stood and walked towards the exit. Lieutenant Orlov fell into step beside her. "Impressive, isn't she?" Orlov said, a genuine awe in his voice. "Colonel Rostova, she doesn't tolerate weakness." "No," Petrova agreed quietly. "She doesn't." "Some of the old-timers, like Baranov, they're too cautious," Orlov continued, eager to demonstrate his alignment with the commander's aggressive mindset. "You can't get ahead by worrying about what might go wrong. You have to drive for success." Petrova glanced at him. His face was young, earnest, full of the dangerous confidence that comes from book knowledge without the tempering of hard experience. "There's a difference between caution and prudence, Lieutenant," she said. "One is based on fear, the other on physics." Orlov looked momentarily confused, as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. He opened his mouth to reply, but she had already turned and was walking down the corridor, leaving him standing alone with her quiet, unsettling words. That night, Petrova didn't sleep. She sat on her bunk and field-stripped her personal med kit, checking every seal, every needle, every ampule, her hands moving with an ingrained, fluid muscle memory. She could do it in complete darkness. She had. She listened to the sounds of the station, the constant hum of life support, the groaning of the structure as the wind outside began to pick up its mournful, rising shriek. The storm was coming. The pressure was building, both outside the habitat and within it. And she knew, with a certainty that settled like a cold stone in her gut, that the breaking point was near. The simulation began at 600 hours. The complex was officially sealed, external communications severed, save for a single monitored link to the umpires at Central Command. For the first few hours, everything ran smoothly. Rostova prowled the command center, a shark in a tank, overseeing the response to a series of simulated system malfunctions. A fire in the hydroponics bay, a minor coolant leak. Her teams responded quickly, efficiently, their actions honed by endless drills. Rostova's sharp commands cut through the professional chatter, directing the flow of the exercise like a conductor. Lieutenant Orlov, at her side, watched with rapt admiration. Petrova remained an observer. She stood in the medical bay, watching the medics run through their own drills on a training dummy. She corrected a young corpsman's technique on applying a chest seal, her advice offered so quietly and gently that it felt like a suggestion, not a command. The corpsman, to his credit, recognized the superior knowledge and nodded his thanks. Outside, the world had vanished. The viewports showed nothing but a churning, hypnotic vortex of white. The wind didn't just howl anymore. It screamed, a high, thin sound of immense power. On the command center's main display, the exterior wind speed indicator climbed steadily. 70 knots, 80, 90. The temperature plummeted. -75, -80. "That's well outside the predicted parameters," the meteorologist said, his voice tight with a nervousness he was trying to conceal. "The habitat is rated for it," Rostova snapped, her eyes fixed on the simulation timers. "Focus on your tasks." Master Sergeant Baranov stepped forward again. "Colonel, that wind speed is putting a critical strain on the main communications array, and at this temperature, the risk to that fuel line is no longer theoretical." "I have heard you, Master Sergeant," Rostova said, her voice dangerously low. "We are in the middle of a certification. We do not stop." Then it happened. The lights flickered once, twice, a frantic, stuttering pulse. A deep groaning sound vibrated through the deck plates, a noise of metal under a strain it was never meant to bear. The main power failed. For a heartbeat, there was absolute blackness and a terrifying, profound silence, the life-giving hum of the station gone. Then the emergency lights kicked in, bathing the corridors in the hellish dim red glow of a submarine on battle stations. A cacophony of alarms blared to life, a discordant symphony of crisis. "What was that?" Rostova's voice, for the first time, held a tremor of uncertainty. "Report!" Before anyone could answer, a concussive boom, loud as a cannon shot, ripped through the complex. It felt like the station had been struck by a giant fist. The deck plates jumped, throwing people off their feet. From the direction of the main observation dome, there was the sound of shattering plasteel and the explosive roar of depressurization. "Structural breach! Module Alpha is compromised!" A voice screamed over the internal comms, choked with panic. "The observation dome it's gone!" Chaos erupted. People were yelling, running, their training forgotten in a primal surge of fear. Rostova stood frozen in the red gloom of the command center, her face a mask of disbelief. "Seal it off! Seal the pressure doors to Alpha!" she yelled, but her command was lost in the din. Lieutenant Orlov was on his feet, his face ashen, looking at his commander for the decisive leadership he'd so admired. But he saw only a woman paralyzed by the sudden violent intrusion of a reality her simulations had never prepared her for. Petrova had been in the medical bay when the power went out. She hadn't flinched. When the explosion hit, she was already moving. She grabbed her black duffel bag, swinging it over her shoulder with an ease that belied its weight. The young medics were panicking, looking around in the dim red light, their training evaporating. "Stay here," Petrova told them, her voice cutting through their fear. It was calm, steady, an anchor in the storm. "Prepare for casualties. Set up triage stations here and here." She pointed to 2 clear areas on the floor. "Get every blanket you can find." She moved out into the corridor. People were running away from the danger. She was moving toward it. She saw 2 engineering techs fumbling with the manual override for the pressure door leading to the breached Alpha module. The alarms shrieked about atmospheric loss. "Get out of the way," she said, not shouting, but with an authority that made them obey instantly. Her hands moved over the control panel with deft, certain motions. She knew the schematics of this station type better than they did. She bypassed the damaged electronic lock and threw the heavy manual lever. With a grinding shriek of tortured metal, the massive door began to slide shut. A final, violent gust of wind and ice crystals blasted through the gap before it sealed with a heavy final thud. The atmospheric alarms fell silent. The immediate danger of a full station depressurization was over. She turned to the 2 stunned techs. "You," she said, pointing to the senior one, "get to engineering. I need a damage report on the life support system and power grid. Focus on the battery reserves. Give me a number in hours." To the other, "Find Master Sergeant Baranov. Tell him to meet me at the breach point with cutting tools and structural braces. Go now." They scrambled to obey, galvanized by her certainty. She continued toward the disaster zone. The air was frigid here, filled with a fine dust of pulverized insulation and ice. The screams had subsided into moans of pain. The red emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows, turning the scene into a tableau from a nightmare. The outer wall of a crew habitation corridor adjacent to the dome had buckled inward, crushing part of the hallway. Men were trapped in the wreckage. She found Lieutenant Orlov first. He was kneeling beside a man whose leg was pinned under a heavy girder, bent at an unnatural angle. The man was screaming, and Orlov was trying to pull the girder off him, his movements frantic and useless. "Stop!" Petrova's voice was quiet, but absolute. It cut through the man's screams and Orlov's panic. The lieutenant looked up, his eyes wide in the red gloom. "I have to get this off him," he gasped. "You'll sever his femoral artery if you shift it wrong," Petrova stated, kneeling beside him. She was already unzipping her bag. "His screaming means his airway is clear. Let him scream. You, hold his shoulders. Keep him from thrashing." Orlov, lost and terrified, did as he was told. He was a follower now, desperate for orders. Petrova's hands moved with a blur of practiced efficiency. She produced a tourniquet and expertly applied it high on the man's thigh, cinching it tight. She injected a syringe of morphine into his quad. Within seconds, his screams subsided into ragged, pain-filled sobs. "His name is Corporal Jensen," Orlov stammered. "All right, Corporal Jensen," Petrova said, her voice soft, speaking to the trapped man. "We're going to get you out, but you have to stay still." She assessed the other casualties with a swift, sweeping glance. A woman with a nasty head wound, dazed but walking. A man clutching his arm, a shard of metal protruding from his bicep. Another lay ominously still. She moved to him first. No pulse, no respiration, pupils fixed and dilated. She spent less than 5 seconds with him before moving on. There was no time for the dead. She began her triage, her movements economical and precise. She carried a roll of colored tape, red, yellow, green, black. She tagged the walking wounded woman green, the man with the arm injury yellow. Corporal Jensen, pinned and critical, got a red tag, the dead man a black one. She was creating order, a medical battle plan in the heart of the chaos. Master Sergeant Baranov arrived, his face grim, carrying a heavy toolkit. He took in the scene, his eyes locking with Petrova's. No words were needed. He saw the triage tags, saw her calm, methodical work, and he understood. He and his tech got to work on freeing Jensen, following Petrova's precise instructions on where to cut, where to brace. Colonel Rostova finally appeared at the edge of the disaster zone, her face pale. She saw the scene, the carnage, the wounded, and the quiet woman in the gray fleece who was now undeniably in command. What is the status?" Rostova asked, her voice faltering. Petrova didn't look up from stabilizing the man with the arm injury. "Status is, we have multiple casualties, a compromised hull, and are running on emergency power that will last at best 6 hours. Your certification exercise is over, Colonel. This is now a rescue operation." The rebuke was delivered with the dispassionate finality of a coroner's report. Rostova flinched as if struck. For the first time in her career, she was a bystander at her own command. The most critical patient was a young geologist, a civilian specialist named Anya Sharma. A piece of the shattered dome had struck her in the chest, a penetrating wound that was causing a tension pneumothorax. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, and a sickening frothy blood was bubbling at her lips. Petrova had managed to insert a decompression needle into her chest cavity, a desperate field measure that was buying them minutes. But she needed surgery. She needed a stasis pod. They carried her to the medical bay, which was now an organized, functioning trauma center under the direction of the 2 medics Petrova had first instructed. Blankets were laid out. Supplies were ready. "Get her into stasis pod 1, Petrova ordered. The lead medic shook his head, his face tight with stress. "We can't, ma'am. The pods are on a secure network. When we lost main power, they went into a hard lockdown. It requires a command-level override. Colonel Rostova tried. Her credentials aren't working." Petrova glanced toward the command center doorway. Rostova stood there, useless, holding a datapad with her rejected access codes. Her authority was as dead as the main power grid. Petrova strode to the stasis pod's control console. The screen glowed with a red forbidding message. "System lockdown. Omega clearance required." "Move," she said to the medic. Her fingers flew across the keypad, typing a string of alphanumeric characters too fast to follow. It wasn't a standard password. It was a command line prompt. "Execute, override, 987D, emergency medical." The system responded, "Command acknowledged, biometric authentication required." A small panel slid open, revealing a palm scanner. Without hesitation, Petrova placed her right hand flat against the glass. The scanner pulsed with a blue light, tracing the lines of her palm, reading her fingerprints, her unique vein patterns. For a moment, the screen displayed her temporary superficial credentials. Petrova, A, Medical Liaison, CEV. Clearance level, guest. Then, the data blinked and was forcefully overwritten. A new profile slammed onto the screen, the text a stark official white on a black background. It was a file from a much deeper, much darker part of the federal database, a place most people didn't even know existed. Identity verified. Petrova, Anna Ilyana. Rank, Chief Warrant Officer 5, RET. Unit, Joint Special Operations Command, Advanced Medical Group. Designation, 18 Delta, Senior SEER Combat Trauma Specialist. Current status, active duty recall. Assignment, Office of the Inspector General, Operational Readiness Division. Title, Senior Evaluator, Clearance, Omega Prime. The screen flashed green. Access granted. With a loud hiss of equalizing pressure, the stasis pod door slid open. The medical bay was utterly silent, save for the desperate gasps of the injured woman and the low hum of the now active pod. The 2 medics stared. At the screen, their mouths agape. Lieutenant Orlov, who had helped carry the stretcher, read the words and looked as if he'd been electrocuted. His entire worldview, his understanding of rank and authority and competence, had just been shattered and reassembled in a terrifying new shape. Colonel Rostova stood frozen, her face drained of all color. She wasn't just facing a failed certification anymore. She was facing an Inspector General's senior field evaluator. The woman she had dismissed as an irrelevant liaison, the woman she had told to stay out of the way, held the fate of her entire career in her quiet, capable hands. This wasn't just a disaster. It was an audit. A full, comprehensive, and brutally honest audit conducted in real time with lives on the line. Master Sergeant Baranov, standing in the doorway, simply looked at the screen, then at Petrova, and gave a slow, single nod. It wasn't a nod of surprise. It was a nod of profound, weary vindication. He didn't know the specifics, but he had recognized the quality. He knew true steel when he saw it. Petrova paid none of them any mind. Her entire focus was on the patient. "Get her in the pod," she commanded, her voice unchanged, still calm, still absolute. Now, they scrambled to obey. The authority in the room had shifted, not through a change of command, but through a revelation of competence so total and undeniable that it rendered rank irrelevant. Orlov and the medics moved with a new kind of urgency, not the frantic energy of panic, but the focused precision of professionals following a true leader. "Lieutenant," Petrova said, not looking up from supervising the patient's transfer into the pod. "Ma'am?" Orlov's voice was a croak. "Get on the emergency comms. There's a tertiary satellite channel encrypted. Use it. Declare a real-world emergency at Northern Vigilance. Tell them the base is compromised, multiple critical casualties. Request immediate CASEVAC and engineering support. My authorization code is 994 Alpha Sigma. They'll know what it means." "Yes, ma'am," Orlov said, and ran from the room, his borrowed arrogance replaced by the humble diligence of a man who had just seen the face of real command. For the next 4 hours, Petrova worked. She was the calm eye in the center of the hurricane. With Baranov as her de facto XO, she orchestrated the entire emergency response. She directed teams to shore up the buckled corridor. She established a rationing plan for the dwindling heat and water reserves. She personally treated every one of the injured, her hands as steady in the dim flickering light as they would be in a brightly lit operating theater. She moved from patient to patient, her quiet presence a reassurance, her skill a promise of survival. Colonel Rostova remained a ghost, a spectator to the salvage of her command. She tried to give an order once, a suggestion about reorganizing the uninjured personnel, but the words died on her lips as she saw everyone, officers, NCOs, and technicians alike, already moving with quiet purpose, following the instructions Petrova had laid out. She had no role left to play. She had been rendered obsolete. As the first pale hint of dawn began to lighten the perpetual twilight of the Arctic storm, the thumping, rhythmic beat of heavy-lift rescue helicopters could be heard in the distance. The sound cut through the howl of the wind, a promise of deliverance. Orlov returned to the medical bay. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Petrova, "the rescue team is 5 minutes out. They're patching into our comms now. A general is on the line for you." Petrova was applying a final dressing to the arm of the yellow-tagged NCO. She didn't look up. "Tell the general I'll call him back when my patients are secure." Orlov stared at her for a second, then a slow smile of understanding touched his lips. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went to relay the message. The hours that followed were a blur of controlled, professional activity. The injured were evacuated. A specialized engineering team landed and began assessing the catastrophic damage to the habitat. The uninjured crew of Northern Vigilance, exhausted and shell-shocked, were mustered and accounted for. Through it all, Petrova remained in the background. Her work was done. She oversaw the transfer of her patients to the care of the incoming medical teams, giving a concise, detailed handover for each one. Her reports were models of clinical precision, devoid of emotion or blame, yet damning in their factual clarity. By midday, the storm had broken, and a weak, watery sunlight illuminated the wrecked complex. The full scale of the disaster was laid bare. The massive observation dome was simply gone, a ragged hole opening the habitat to the sky. Petrova found a quiet corner in the now crowded but stable engineering section. She opened her black duffel bag and began, with methodical care, to clean her instruments. She wiped the blood from her forceps, sterilized her scalpels, and repacked her suture kits. Each item was inspected, cleaned, and returned to its proper place, her movements a ritual of order and control. It was the only way she knew how to decompress, to process the chaos by restoring her own small piece of the world to perfect order. A shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Colonel Rostova standing there. The colonel's face was haggard, her uniform disheveled. The rigid armor of her authority was gone, leaving only a tired, defeated woman. They told me my command is suspended, pending your full report, Rostova said, her voice barely a whisper. I've been recalled. I'll be leaving on the next transport. Petrova continued to wipe down a hemostat, her focus absolute. She said nothing. The things I said, Rostova continued, struggling for words, the way I didn't know who you were. Petrova finally paused. She looked up, her gaze meeting the colonel's. Her eyes were not angry, not triumphant, not even disappointed. They were simply clear, like looking into a deep, cold well. You're right, Colonel, Petrova said, her voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. You didn't know who I was, but Baranov did. Your medics did. Your techs did. They knew something was wrong. They tried to tell you. You didn't have to know who I was. You just had to listen to your people. She placed the cleaned hemostat back in its designated slot in the kit. The quiet click of the tool settling into place was the only sound. Rostova stood there for a long moment, the truth of Petrova's words washing over her. There was nothing more to say. She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the damaged corridor. Petrova finished her task. She closed her kit, the zippers sliding shut with a soft, final sound. She shouldered the bag, stood up, and walked toward the newly installed temporary viewport. Outside, the vast, indifferent landscape of the Arctic stretched to the horizon, a canvas of white and blue under the cold sun. Her official report was already composed in her mind, precise, factual, and unsparing. It would speak not of her own actions, but of a structural failure, a generator failure, and a leadership failure. The first two could be repaired. The last one was the most dangerous. The work was done. The standard, paid for in blood and fear, had been upheld. She stood alone, watching the sun, a quiet, unassuming figure who was nothing more and nothing less than the last line of defense,